After the siege of Boston, the British load up their ships and they leave on March 17th. Aboard 11,000 people, including troops, and the remainder of the Royalists that wanted to go with them that were in the area. Where they went was north to Halifax, up in Nova Scotia. But Washington does not know where they are planning to strike next. He doesn't even know that they've gone to Halifax. And so he has to guess where they might attack next. He imagines that it will be New York. He guesses right, not that it's that hard. It's a pretty large city with a large harbor, and so it is a prime target. But he has his army march to New York as the British are actually leaving. They have to pick it up and move. Quick march down there and start to get ready to defend that city. The city was fortified by the army, but this was not the best plan, in part because New York is too exposed to attack from sea. If you look at this map here, you can see, it's a little hard to read, this is Long Island here. This is the Atlantic Ocean. These are where the two rivers come, or where the river comes in, the James River and the East River. And then this over here is water too. This is all a big island called Long Island that goes out this way. Manhattan is what you see of New York usually, is right down here in the middle. So if you look at this, the British can sail in here. This is not all that narrow. And they can move pretty much around the bay all they want to. And you may remember that their navy was greatly superior to the Continental. So they had no qualms about being able to sail in here. They could sail in over here. And once they're in, they can menace a lot of these different areas. Come in all the way around this island and menace. So it's not necessarily the best plan to try to defend this area. On the other hand, there is a large population in New York that would feel like they weren't being treated with respect if the army didn't come to help them. But there's also a large number of Royalists mixed in that are going to help the British, not help the Continental Army, and so that makes it a challenge as well. So now let's turn this around and look at it from the British point of view. They have to think about where they're going to land and where they're going to attack first too. So as I said, Washington wanted to defend it being New York here because it's important. But if you look too, he has to spread his forces too thin to defend the city. I guess it's my opinion here, but it is reflected from many people. He just should have let New York go and not worried about it and concentrated his forces elsewhere. So the British war fleet arrives in New York Harbor in June of 1776. One day, they just start sailing in. And when I say they just start sailing in, they keep coming, and they keep coming, and they keep coming. By the time they're done in July, there is a lot of military power floating out there at sea. There are 30 battleships, 1,200 cannon on those ships, 30,000 soldiers, 10,000 sailors, and in addition to those battleships, there's 300 supply ships. So if you can imagine that you're up here looking out to sea or out into the harbor and you see all these ships, and they are not friendly ships. They are the British. Washington was very nervous about that. The Navy there was under the command of Admiral Lord Richard Howe, and the Army at this time was under the command of General William Howe. And yes, they're brothers. And so they are able to work together. Historically, the British Army and Navy of this time period did not work well together. Usually that would be a disadvantage, but in this case, because they're brothers, they work together better than most. And you'll see that the Navy comes to a lot of the aid of the Army over time and finds a way to help both help resupply them as well as land them places where they can do some real damage. But Washington does not know where they'll attack. So he has to fortify the cities and the areas around, but there's a lot to do. He also wants to hold back the Navy, so he blocks the rivers. He sank boats, old boats, in places where it was narrow to try to, well, not him personally, but they sank boats and tried to block the river, and then they put cannon above the other side so that they could fire on the ships that tried to go through. In other words, one of the things you should know if you're a soldier is that part of the time you actually don't fight all that much, and you drill every day and you prepare every day, but you often do many other things. And in this case, these soldiers had to work as engineers, Engineers in the sense that they had to build these defensive positions. They had to build and reinforce forts along the way, and they had to create positions that they could defend if they were attacked. And that's what they spent most of their time here, those that weren't sick, because there was a lot of sickness moving through the army at this time too. In the midst of all of this work, back in the Continental Congress in Philadelphia, Richard Henry Lee of Virginia puts forward a resolution that they make a declaration of independence. This was done and passed on July 2nd, 1776, and approved by Congress on July 4th, 1776, and that's where you see all their names signed on the document. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, and so on. We'll look a little bit more at this declaration elsewhere. But this is when that happens. New York is about to be attacked. The ships have started to roll in, and the Continental Congress is busy working on that. So the British do decide to attack. They decide to attack at Long Island. But before they do that, the British Admiral and General decide to offer surrender terms, but they don't do a very good job of it. In fact, they don't send their invitation to the right person or in the right way, and so the Continentals refuse to meet with them until they finally get it right, and even then they don't get it completely right. They're just not taking the Continental Army seriously, or General Washington, so they're refusing to acknowledge him as a general of an army. So the Washington listens and sends them on their way. They send another. They meet also with some of the members of Continental Congress and offer them surrender terms, and they turn them down as well. So now they have to plan a way to attack Long Island. Clinton, one of Howe's generals, had a pretty good plan. His plan was to sneak around to the side and outflank the Americans. The local loyalists worked with them to do this. There were farmers that led their forces around the Continental Army. They did this overnight, and they were followed by a good number of British Army. They had to walk a long way or march a long way, but they managed to attack the Continental Army from the side, and this was a surprise for them. To keep the rest of the army in place so they could attack it from the side, in the morning the British attacked along the entire front, just enough to keep the armies in place. The Continental Army at the time felt like they were doing a great job. They were keeping the British, they were meeting them, and they were fighting them, and the British Army was unable to advance past them. What they didn't know was that the British Army really wasn't trying to get past them. They were just trying to hold them in place, because they knew an attack was coming from the side. So they maintain their attack. The attack comes from the side, and Washington had to defend in so many places that his forces here were outnumbered 2-1. Remember, he feels like he has to defend New York City. He has to defend all along the coast there. Long Island is just one of the many places that he has to defend. So the army is outflanked. As I said, outflanked means that they come from the side, from the flank of the army, and attack into the middle. And the army scatters and runs, and they retreat to an area called Brooklyn Heights, a higher section on the New York side of Long Island. Here's a quick picture of that in case you want to see. I'll show you where their attack came from. You can see this is Long Island here right in the middle, and this is Manhattan over here. This is the Brooklyn Heights they're going to retreat to. So working our way backward, forces under Alexander and Sullivan attacked the Continental Army here in a straight attack. Meanwhile, around the outside came Clinton, followed by Cornwallis and Percy, and they came up this road that farmers told them about, and that the Continental Army failed to defend very well. If they had paid attention and defended that, they at least would have known that they were coming there and been able to fight better. But they didn't even know they were coming. And so they attack here. They push the American forces back to here, onto Brooklyn Heights. And at the end of the day, that's where it stood. The British had defeated the Continental Army. The Continental Army was just trying to get everybody back together here and organize their way out of the situation or prepare to fight the next morning. And so Washington is faced with the decision: do I cross the East River at night in boats to escape, or do I stay and fight with this army? And his decision was to cross the East River in the dark overnight and escape with the army intact. So he set forces up along the front to make it look like the army was still there, and he very quietly withdrew the army a little bit at a time so that they all went through this landing here and across to New York City in boats. This is actually one of the amazing stories, and there are a number of them where there are people who manage these boats, and somehow they're able to safely move whole armies across rivers, sounds, and other areas so that they can escape. In this case, it's a pretty amazing feat that they did that. We're talking not just about moving men, but moving horses, moving, in some cases, cannon, and things out of the way, and military supplies across and away from the British so they can't seize them. In the morning, the British wake up and the Americans are gone. George Washington and his Continental Army have escaped to New York, where they are still fortified, and so they have to go about redoing their plan. So the Battle of Long Island was a huge victory, really, for the British in many ways, but George Washington did pretty good to pull his forces out. Once again, too, the Continental Army did fight, although they lost, but they did fight, and the British did not expect this army to really fight against them. They expected them to give up relatively easily, and they did not do so. So a rather dejected, a rather tired army ends up in New York.